Hello, this is another one of my teaching videos. We'll see how much you get out of this one. I know some of the videos are going to be more interesting to some of you guys than others, but I hope you get something out of this one. Some of this one was done kind of long distance because this was my son's car. That's one of his dogs there. He lives over in Georgia. But this one here, somebody had sold it to my son for a really good price when it already had a lot of miles on it. And he drove over there one day and wanted to know if we put some rear struts on it. And so it's a little bit of a job to put struts on a Camry like this one here. It's a 98 model. And whenever they got through working the struts, it was a 4-post lift that they had. It was a drive-on lift, the 4-poster. And when they went to back it off, the yo-yo that was backing it off, we didn't look to pay attention to make sure all the doors were closed. He had to be in the back seat back there to do some of the work on the struts. And he backed up and destroyed the right rear door on the car. And so I basically called the salvage yard about 30 miles from where we were, and he had a door for a Camry like that in stock. And I sent my son over there with a check for $150, and they got another door put on the car. This is one of the perils of teaching, and it seems like when they made an error like that, it was always on a vehicle that belonged to me or one of my family or something like that. They did pretty good on the cars that belonged to everybody else. But anyway, that was it. But there was another trip that he made when he had an oil leak that he had repaired at a local to him, a tire store. And they looked under there and they said, oh, that's the oil pan gasket. And they charged him something like $400 to replace the oil pan gasket. But all the way down, he was having to put about a quart of oil every 100 miles in it. He was checking it regularly. It was still leaking really, really bad. And so whenever he got down to where he was, he brought it over to the college and we raised it up on the lift. And what we found was the oil pump. And anybody that's worked on hardly any of these cars knows that oil pump gasket is very prone to leak. It gets hard. It's just an O-ring. It's an odd-shaped O-ring that goes around that cover. And that oil pump was leaking right there where it goes on, and it was trickling down here. Well, that's actually the edge of the oil pump. And it was running off the oil pan, and it tricked them into thinking they had an oil pan leak. And so I actually wrote up a little invoice with this picture on it like we have here and sent it back over there, and they gave him the money back that they charged him to put the pan on there. It didn't leak any oil after we did that. But anyway, we used dye the first time I had seen one of these. And this is a picture of the one that we found it on. Was a 98 Camry. That was a different Camry that belonged to my lunch partner. And he was noticing oil on the floor of his garage. And so we put some dye in there and fired up our black light, and this is what we saw coming out of there. It was very easy to pick up on that. That's his original pan gasket, but you can see where it was leaking around the oil pump. The oil pump on these 2.2 liter Camry engines is driven by the timing belt, which is interesting in and of itself. It worked good, nothing wrong with it. That's really a common leak on those engines. Well, another work on my son's Camry, the water pump locked up and stripped the timing belt, and this mechanic friend of his put a timing belt on it, but noticed that when he was turning the engine by hand to verify the belt was timed right, it would stop at a certain point like something was on the head of the piston. And he thought he had bent a valve, but I told him, I said, those 2.2s don't bend valves. There's something else going on there. And when the guy pulled the cylinder head off, what he found was that he had a bunch of carbon that had dropped down there on the head of the piston and had piled up to the point where when the piston came up it would contact the cylinder head before it was at top dead center. Then that confused him into thinking it had been a valve because he wasn't familiar with that particular engine. The mechanic had worked on it. He's a pretty good mechanic, pretty sharp. Well, the mill light came on after this particular job was finished, and that turned into an issue. So this is a PO125 code. Now I've fixed a lot of PO128s and PO125s. That basically means the thermostats, its engine's running too cold. It's pretty much what it is. And most people back in the day, whenever I was just starting out, they wanted the engine to always run really, really cool down there, closer to colder the better. But that's really not a healthy engine when you're running one that's that far down in the cold range. It needs to be running right up in the middle, about 200 degrees. And so this particular one, he was concerned because of the PO125 and the code, and he wanted to get rid of that. And I said everybody was telling him that's got to be a thermostat. It's got to be a thermostat. It's running too cold. It's got to be a thermostat. And so they worried with it. They put a thermostat on it. Now on this one here, the thermostat's in the bottom, and the hose that's coming from the top of the engine over to the other part of the radiator. It's really a good design, and there's a lot of vehicles that are like that. First time I ever saw one of these was on a 2.8 in an old Mustang from back in the 70s, but if the thermostat's on the bottom, when you fill the engine up with coolant, it's very easy for all the air to come out through that top, because the thermostat's usually what's trapping the air, you see. A lot of the thermostats have got them little bitty vent holes, that bleeds the air out when you're filling it up, so you don't get a bunch of air bound trapped in there. I like to, when I'm putting coolant in one, I like to pour it, take a heater hose off and from up there and pour it. Sometimes I use a transmission funnel to pour it in through the heater hose to make doggone sure that thing's just as full as it can be. Have the radiator cap off, pour it in there until it comes up in the radiator. That way there's not any air bubbles trapped in there, and there's no danger of jamming in the cylinder head or something like that with an overheating problem. But anyway, this thing right here did not have a bad thermostat. So I researched on that code, and I discovered something I'd never seen on any other vehicle. That PO125 doesn't always mean a thermostat on a Toyota Camry. It can mean something else. Most of the posted fixes I found on it, on the database I was checking, was talking about the, call it air fuel sensor, we like to call it the oxygen sensor, and if it never comes alive, closed loop's faraway dream. So what that code basically saying was it was never able to enter closed loop. Now if it doesn't get warm enough, it won't enter closed loop either. Closed loop's important if you want to have good fuel control, so that your emissions are as clean as possible. And so whenever they type the algorithms for that one, they obviously, if it can't go into closed loop because of the oxygen sensor not coming online, or completely being dead, then it's subject to throw a PO125. But it seems to me like it ought to throw a code for an oxygen sensor of some kind, but this one didn't do that. All right, so I was doing this long distance with my son and his mechanic over the phone, just trying to help him out as much as I could. Well, so what we need to do, and I always like to do this, when I had a code for something like that, I always like to make sure that the heater part of the oxygen sensor is working. Incidentally, I'm going to mention that in a minute later, but I like to measure the heater to see if it's got about 6 ohms of resistance, because that's what the oxygen sensor heater is supposed to have. But I also need to know if there's current going to the heater. And so one of the things I like to do is I like to take a light bulb, just a little, sometimes I'll just use a regular tail light bulb in a socket, and I'll hook it up so that, if I got an old oxygen sensor, I'll clip the pigtail off of that. And the two wires in the oxygen sensor pigtail that are the same color are typically the ones that feed the heater. Okay, so if you hook a light bulb between those two, and you plug that into the harness coming from the engine, and you crank it up, that light should come on. Because if you crank it up, that light's going to be coming on because it's going to have current for the heater. If the light doesn't come on, you need to be looking back toward the engine controller, see if there are rats chewed wires or pin pushed back somewhere, something like that. All right, and so that's what I have built, one of those tools for just about every time I get an oxygen sensor job to replace, I cut that pigtail off and save it in case I ever need to test a heater circuit, because it's really quick. I always want a quick job, something I can do really nice and quick. Make sure you're using the right pinout for the vehicle you're working on, but you can also pay attention to which wires are the same color. Sometimes both the wires will be brown, sometimes both of them will be white. But if it's got two wires the same color and you measure it with an ohm meter, you can typically tell, if you've got, that's the two wires you're going to measure with an ohm meter when you're looking at the sensor, and the corresponding two cavities are where you're gonna, where the light's gonna be hooked up whenever you plug it in. If you got your pigtail, you can use that. All right, so that's kind of what the bulb's gonna look like. And a lot of these instructors that I've heard from some of these, like the Freightliner schools and all that kind of stuff, they say, throw your test light away. You'll never need another test light. Always use a logic probe or a high impedance meter. I was working on a Taurus one time using that philosophy, and the Ford book led me to check the voltage at a particular spot, and if it was over 10.5 volts, then it was supposed to be good and all that. But it turned out that I had a bad relay. In spite of the fact that my meter was reading 10.5 volts, that voltage, which needed to be good and strong, wouldn't even burn a test light. And it turned out I had a bunch of relay contact resistance for some reason, oxidation, I don't know what it was, but the long and the short of it was, I went around and around and around. If you're working with a circuit that requires current to work, and you're not checking it with something that pulls just about as much current as the circuit pulls, then you're not doing a good test. One time I ran into a situation on a Ford Ranger where when I unplugged the fuel pump, the power and ground with my test light, which is a regular test light, not one of those logic probes, but it was a regular test light. It would burn that test light. And I said, well, we got power and ground coming to the pump, so let's go ahead and test the pump. So we put power and ground to the pump would run if we put power and ground directly to the pump. And so then I got a headlight bulb, which pulls about 5 or 6 amps. And when I hooked that headlight bulb up, where I had hooked up that test light, that headlight bulb wouldn't burn because there was not enough current there. And I turned out that I found out the ground side of that circuit was fouled up. And in that case, I don't know what was going on with the ground circuit. I didn't try to track it down. I just went ahead and ran another wire right over there to the frame, and put a good solid screw ground on there, and that took care of that problem. But anyway, don't get lied to by a digital meter, because it's going to read voltage even if there's not enough there to pull current. Just like an ohm meter will read a good reading if you're looking for something to carry a load. To be perfectly honest, you usually can't depend on a meter. You're going to have something that's going to load that circuit. All right, there was no current here. This is what we found. There was nothing there. Now, if the heater's not heating the oxygen sensor up so that it can come online, or if it comes online too slow, it might even throw that code. So we needed to figure out what was going on there. All right. This is what the connector looked like. Had it in his hand. It looked like that. He took that picture and showed it to me. And the problem was when he turned the connector over, he saw this. That's that one right there. That wire pulled out. Turned out to be that's what his problem was. Now, I told him and his buddy over there, I said, get you some solder and heat shrink and put another pigtail on there, what you need to do. And, go ahead and replace the sensor while you're at it, And so, but what they did was that P125 was caused by that, watching voltage in relation to this ground. It wasn't there. O2 was flat as far as PCM was concerned. So Luke and his wrench smart friend set about to make the repairs with butt connectors. I hate butt connectors. And a pigtail they got from somewhere, but they did the job with a key on, and the next thing that happened was a no start. Popped fuse. And so I managed to vector them into the right fuse, and the fuse that feeds the EFI relay had popped. And the exception when you're using butt connectors, by the way, if you're beside the road and you need to get somewhere. One time my mom and I were taking a trip to the Grand Canyon on an old 72 Impala, and we were driving along, and I kept hearing noises and seeing little black things bouncing in the road behind me. And finally the alternator light came on, and when I stopped it had thrown, the belts had come apart. Call me goofy back in 1978 for not checking the belts before we went on a trip. But I had extra belts in the trunk. So I got my tools out and I put the belts on it. Well, after I put the belts on it, I tried to start it and it still wouldn't start. It just, I said, well, I wonder if that alternator belt was slipping long enough to where this thing doesn't have any battery juice, although I do see dash lights coming on and stuff. And so we were about a mile outside of Muleshoe, Texas. And so I left my mother reading a book in the car. You know, it was kind of in the fall of the year, it wasn't that hot. And so I ran a mile, which I could do then. And actually the last, little bit of the distance, I got a ride from a man and his wife that were coming along there. And they dropped me off at this gas station right there at the edge of town. And I told the guy, I said, I need to be jumped off. I'm right outside of town here. And so he got a pair of jumper cables and an old Thunderbird, and we headed out there. And he didn't even know how to connect the jumper cables. I don't know what he's working at a gas station for. I mean, he's a nice enough guy. I mean, he's wearing coveralls and he looked like a mechanic, but I hooked the jumper cables up and there was nothing there. Still. And I says, I got to figure out what's going on here. So I got over here and I laid down under the car, or actually behind the right rear or right front wheel. And I reached up in there with my pocket knife and I shorted the solenoid on the starter, against the solenoid wire, and it fired the motor up. And so I paid that guy, I don't know what I gave him. I gave him $20 or $5 or something. I don't remember what I handed him. Back in 1978, anything I gave him would have been a lot of money. But we went on over there, and I got to thinking I could jack this thing up with a bumper jack, and I could get under there, but it might fall on me. And so we stopped in at a gas station over there close to the Colorado River, and this the guy raised the thing up, and that fusible link had popped going to the starter solenoid. Anybody that's familiar with those Chevrolets know what I'm talking about. And we just replaced that fusible link, and we used a butt connector because that's about all he had. That's when you use a butt connectors when you need to get back on the road. It's not a good permanent fix most of the time, although there are some butt connectors that have heat shrink built onto them that are pretty decent. But anyway, I've just never really liked butt connectors. The replacement of that fuse, the no start was handled, but the first time he drove the car to work, this MIL came back on. He got around to retrieving the diagnostic trouble codes. He discovered a P0135, which meant the O2 sensor heater is either pulling too much current or not enough, and that led him to a poorly crimped butt connector, which he replaced, and the problem was solved. Test question 1. Technician A says O2 sensors start working as soon as the exhaust starts flowing. Technician B says O2 sensors have always been equipped with heaters. Who's right? A only, B only, both, or neither? Technician A says the O2 sensor signal will always read rich on a bank with a misfiring spark plug. Technician B says the O2 sensor signal can be interpreted by a knowledgeable technician to determine when the exhaust gas is flowing through the EGR valve. Who's right about that? Don't you just hate Technician A and B questions? The ASE people use them a lot. Technician A says the downstream O2 sensor can be used by the PCM as a feedback signal to adjust the air-fuel mixture. Technician B says the downstream O2 sensor signal should switch at the same rate as the front sensor. Who's correct? Technician A says O2 sensor 1.1 and O2 sensor 2.1 are both on the same bank, but 2.1 is behind the catalyst. Technician B says O2 sensors 2.2 and 2.1 are both located on bank 2. Who's correct? Billy Bob has retrieved a set of diagnostic trouble codes on the scan tool indicating an O2 sensor heater circuit problem and a lean exhaust indication for the same sensor. Technician A says he should look for a vacuum leak on the suspect bank first. Technician B says the O2 heater problem should be addressed first. Who is steering Billy Bob in the right direction? A, B, either or neither? Well, Technician A says the scan tool will tell a knowledgeable technician all he or she needs to know concerning O2 sensor operation. Technician B says the actual circuit should be checked for power and ground at the O2 sensor connector. Technician A, B, both, or neither. Technician A says early O2 sensors were fed by the ignition switch through the fuse panel and hardwired to ground. Technician B says that O2 sensor heaters have always been directly or indirectly controlled by the PCM. After a P0141 code is received with an O2 sensor disconnected on the bench and the sensor heater wires measured with the DVOM, the heater resistance should be what? On a system with 3 oxygen sensors, if your scan tool retrieves failure codes for all 3 O2 heaters, you should A, replace all 3 sensors, B, Check the heater circuit PIDs, if available, and see if fault flags are displayed. C, trace each circuit from the PCM to the sensor, or D, both B and C. Now, what's the best way to check engine control harness circuit integrity? A, with the PCM disconnected, a pinout chart, a low impedance voltmeter. B, with the PCM disconnected, a pinout chart, a wiring schematic, a test light or DVOM. C, with the PCM disconnected and a scan tool connected, or D, none of the above is acceptable. Now let's whip through our answers right quick and see how we did. Alright, neither one of those guys are right. Oxygen sensors have not always had heaters. The first oxygen sensors I knew anything about came out in 1975. And I think it was on Saabs. They called them lambda sensors back then, but these had one wire depended on the threads into the exhaust for a ground. O2 sensors have not always been equipped with heaters. O2 sensors are not going to start working as soon as the exhaust starts flowing either. They have to reach operating temperature, which is 600 degrees if it's a conventional oxygen sensor and 1400 if it's a wideband sensor. Alright, will it always read rich on a bank with a misfiring spark plug? Well, what you're going to see when it starts misfiring, and this trips people up, if you ask them what will the oxygen sensor read when spark plug starts misfiring, everybody will say rich, but that's not true, because the oxygen sensor is not smelling gas. Couldn't care less about gas. It's just looking at oxygen. And if you got air going through there that hasn't been, united with the gas in combustion, you're going to see oxygen even if there's gas blowing past it at the same time. So it's going to start out reading lean, but then it's probably going to dial it rich to try to fix that, what it perceives as a lean condition. And so you may see oxygen sensors, one of them reading rich, the other reading lean or something like that. So that's B only. Technician A says the downstream O2 sensor can be used by the PCM as a feedback signal to adjust air-fuel mixture. Believe it or not, and you may not have ever heard this, that's true. What it's wanting to do is keep that catalytic converter happy. And if that front oxygen sensor becomes unreliable and it knows it's unreliable, it's going to start paying attention to that back one. And it's going to alter a fuel trim based on what the back oxygen sensor tells it. Because it's not just going to go dumb and stupid and start cooking up the catalytic converter if there's any way it can determine what that mix is. And so it will basically use that rear one. Although a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people argue with you about it. But it will do that. And think about it. If they're wanting to protect the catalytic converter, it's going to pay attention to that back one. That can be demonstrated if you play around a little bit with some stuff, and check it. But anyway, another story. The downstream sensor should not switch at the same rate as the front sensor. It should be lazy because you're measuring how well the catalyst stores oxygen with that rear sensor. Technician A says O2 sensor 1.1 and O2 sensor 2.1 are both on the same bank, but 2.1 is behind the catalyst. No, 1.1 and 2.1 are on opposite banks in front of the catalyst, right? Technician B says O2 sensors 2.2 and 2.1 are both on bank 2. Now here's the thing. On a Ford, where is bank 1? And on a Chevy, where is bank 1? Bank 1 on a Chevy is the driver's side bank, and on a Dodge, bank 2 on a Ford is on that side. So you basically have got 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the passenger side if it's a V8 Ford, and 5, 6, 7, and 8 on the driver's side. On a Chevy, 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the passenger side, 5, 6, well actually 1, 3, 5, and 7, and then 2, 4, 6, and 8, the way they do. Dodge and Chevy do both do that. But the point is, bank 1 is where HO2S11 is going to be, and it'll be on the opposite side on a Ford than it will be on a Chevy and a Dodge. So just be aware of that and don't get caught up on always thinking 1.1 is in the same place on every engine. Old Billy Bob's got a heater circuit problem. Well, what I want to do is I'm going to go after that heater first, because that's going to be what your code's telling you to do. If you got a heater circuit problem, you do it. And those heaters do die, and they burn out, and they open up, and all that. So occasionally you'll find one that shorts out and blows a fuse. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So that's technician B. Technician A says the scan tool will tell a knowledgeable technician all they need to know concerning O2 heater operation. That's not really so. It'd help. You can get some information that way, but you need to gather good data. B says the actual circuit should be checked for power and ground at the O2 sensor connector. If you think you got a problem with the heater, you may not find it with a scan tool. A lot of people just want to shotgun a sensor on there as soon as they get a code. That's how you get in trouble and spend unnecessary money. That's disgusting, particularly if you're working on your own vehicle, but I don't know how many times I've seen that. Alright, early O2 sensor heaters were fed by the ignition switch through the fuse panel and hardwired to ground. Believe it or not, that's the way the early Fords were. They used to have 3-wire sensors. And they would basically, the ignition switch would go directly to that thing and fire up that heater. The engine controller wasn't controlling it then. It was OBD1 back in those days, but these smart guys recognized you needed that heater, that oxygen sensor, to get hot a lot quicker. But they did do it with that. After PL141 codes retrieved, the O2 sensor disconnected on the bench. Heater wires ought to read 6 ohms. I did cover that earlier. On a system with 3 oxygen sensors, if your scan tool receives failure codes for all 3 O2S heaters, there's a possibility that could have failed one at a time, and they didn't bring the vehicle in until the check engine light had been on for a year. But the first thing I'm going to be doing is looking at heater circuits PIDs to see if fault flags are displayed, and trace each circuit from the PCM to the sensor. It's just a smart way to do that. And with the PCM disconnected, a pinout chart, a wiring schematic, and a test light or a digital voltometer is the smartest way to check harness integrity. If you've got the PCM plugged in, then there's going to be some circuits in there that are going to give you bad readings. As a matter of fact, if you're checking resistance with an ohm meter on just about any part of a vehicle, you need to disconnect the battery, or you may get ghostly readings that don't make any sense. Because I fell into a trap like that a time or two. The smartest thing to do is disconnect the battery if you're going to make any kind of ohm measurements with a really sensitive digital voltometer. Hope you got something out of this, and give me some feedback one way or another. See you next time.